Thanks for joining me in my first long play video. This is a video I've been meaning to make for years and years and years. I have loved this game ever since it was first. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. I used to read about this game in Velga VGA Dispatch with crappy little dev screenshots when I was such a little dude. I didn't know what screenshots were or what devs were. All I knew is I had to get Hyper Glycol Cube on day one of launch. I was only 7, and the World Wide Web was not yet a way station of unreleased game info. But I had done my research. Hyper Glycol Cube was a launch title for the Velga Ultra VGA gaming system, which, at the time, was the most advanced consumer entertainment computing array available to civilians. Velga Enterdustries had a lot riding on the success of their little machine that could. This was before next-gen was a given in the realm of gaming. Every previous next-gen had been defined by a different system, created by a different manufacturer. The idea of upgrading to the new console had not been normalized yet. Parents rebelled at the marketing tactic, making their first grades ramble on and on about bit rates and VRAM. The adults were too out of technological touch to realize that these were legitimate technological improvements. Their kids weren't being brainwashed by marketing, but sincerely excited about technological improvements. This was also an era where there was no mistaking the capabilities of a new game system. Nobody could see screens rendered with 256 colors instead of 16 and fail to appreciate the improvement. There were new expressive possibilities, but the loosening of certain restrictions had a ratcheting effect on the work. No longer were only 4 basic analog waveforms the limit for the soundtrack, but we were all so excited for 16-bit PCM samples that we didn't even realize to pour a yoo-hoo out on the sidewalk for those sick arpeggiated triangle bass lines that instantly put you into the prior generation. I had done my research, and despite being only so small, I took steps to ensure that I would be prepared upon the Velga Ultra VGA's launch. One particularly striking innovation of the Ultra was this: the chrominance and luminance channels were available separately. If you chose to forego the pack-in composite cable for a superior add-on product available only by mail order. I was fortunate that my grandmother's television possessed the requisite S-video port to allow my tiny self to take full advantage of the slight increases in definition that this 2-channel video process allowed. And every slight increase was most assuredly worth it. As you can see, from the opening moments, the ludological masterpiece that is Hyper Glycol Cube reveals the artistry that went into its creation. It's become a truism that the CPU on the Velga Ultra had the slowest clock speed of all of this generation of gaming entertainment device system console units. But that truism conceals the realism within. The clock speed was slower in overall cycles per second. This cannot be denied. But there were 2 powerful counter-arguments in the Ultra VGA's favor, advanced RISC architecture, which managed to wring several more instructions per clock cycle out of the processor than rival units, for one. But far more significantly, the graphical processing capabilities native in the Velga put those in the competitors' systems to everlasting shame that would not abate with time but only grow the fiercer the more that the rivals dwelt upon it. And, while the full capabilities of the system would not be demonstrated until titles near the end of its product cycle, like Tetron Diameter, Strike, and Dino Team Canyon 2, Velga wanted to ensure that they wowed with the Ultra VGA right out of the gate. It was essential to the fortunes of the system and the company itself that the launch title for this brand new system would make it abundantly clear to the world why they needed a Velga Ultra VGA under their Christmas tree this year. In short, Velga needed Hyper Glycol Cube to be a masterpiece. There's nothing unusual about that. Companies find themselves in positions where their future is riding on their next product every day. What was so remarkable about Hyper Glycol Cube is not that they needed a masterpiece, it's that they delivered one.
Everything that the preceding games in the Glycol Cube series did right had been amped up to the next level and then multiplied for the launch of the Velga Ultra VGA. The interactive map screens of Glycol Cubed, as the third game in the series had been stylized, were now complex shifting scenes that varied depending on the number of secret cubes the player unlocked. The hidden hyperspace rifts that would let players overleap huge stretches of the game had been turned into dozens upon dozens of secret goalposts that would unlock new paths, levels, and strategies as the player progressed through an imaginative cornucopia of themed levels and stylized worlds brimming with hostile entities and outlandish imagery. All the enemies from prior games were back, but with hellish new upgrades hinging on even more subtle variations of color. The crawling Grimbos are here, with vicious curved fangs, but so too are their engorged cousins, the Grawbo. Both the marching and high-flying Greppa Battalion Cotillion are here again, but with twisted new varieties, such as the napalm-spewing Crimson Greppa and the massive, ground-shaking Vermilion Goopa Greppa. Speeding projectile. Pite enemies hurtle towards the Glycol Defender as before, but joining the ranks, the screen-filling Positron Pite variant struck almost immediate fear in the hearts of all the tiny children experiencing the game for the first time as its implacable grin filled the crackling, dust-attracting CRT screens of the past, and it became instantly clear, almost from the beginning of the first level, that the Velga Ultra VGA was not like the Velga before it. Joining the familiars were a long list of new creatures, some, like the two-hit taking Smash Dragons, were never to be seen in a Glycol Universe game again. Others, like the subterranean ambush predator Frankie Ferret, became part of the canon. Still others, like the bodybuilding boxing buddies, would seem to be one and done baddies until making a sudden reappearance decades later in the Velga VGS handheld title Hyper Glycol Cube Battle. Far from coming across as a mismatch of the old and new, the presence of nostalgic familiars and all manner of new characters revitalized what could have seemed like a paint-by-numbers game, 4 in a series. The sense that the game was exploding with imagination came across in all aspects. The improved, more detailed and more colourful worlds and characters, the more interactive overworld map, the heightened number of secrets, and in the expansive genre-straddling soundtrack that accompanied every level. The sound effects themselves were rich, crisp, and varied. It became evident just how limited in timbral possibilities the sound chip on the Velga was in comparison. Not only could it only make 4 different sounds, either all at once or separately, but when a sound effect occurred in an 8-bit game, it would stop the music playing on whichever one of the 4 channels was needed for the sound effect. This is something I never noticed as a child playing, but could never unhear once it had been pointed out to me. A fascinating, everyday example of the removal of previously mandatory barriers. Not only did the sound effects in games for the new Ultra VGA no longer need to displace the music when triggered, but the sounds themselves went from being your choice of 4 channels, each with very few editable parameters, to whatever sound you could shrink down to fit in the RAM of the system's sound chip. This presented developers, in practice, with a new set of barriers. Far from being the barn gate thrown wide open gift to sound designers and game soundtrack composers, it might sound like the constraints of the system were considerable, particularly the microscopic amount of memory reserved solely for music and sound effects. Digital sampling technology is in fact a wonderful thing, and it was coming into its own in the early 90s. The impact of advances in digital sampling technology could be found everywhere, from exciting new genres of music to new methods of producing cinematic soundtracks, but also, once the technology had been miniaturized and brought down in cost sufficiently, also in talking toys, alarm clocks for the visually impaired that spoke the time in halting, oddly concatenated digital phonemes, eventually greeting cards that played a snippet of music when you opened them. It was technology destined to displace analog sound reproduction in almost every area of life, and infuse sound reproduction into areas where it had never been. As monumental as these developments are, once a development begins to gather steam in the digital space, it is only fitting that an example of that technology that is now over 3 decades old in its design should seem limited by our current standards. But the limitations of the 16 kilobyte sound chip on the Ultra VGA are frankly astonishing. The composer for the Hyper Glycol Cube series, Mori Momentoro, described working on Ultra VGA soundtracks as, quote, 50 times harder than doing a Velga Entertronic soundtrack, easily. Because you had to create all your own sounds. Okay, fair enough. But then you had to mash them down so small that they would fit in 1% of a floppy disk, along with all the sound effects and the actual compositions. That was easily the vast majority of the time I spent on those soundtracks. Not composing, not arranging. Stuffing into a tiny digital suitcase. Leaving aside the matter of how hard this work was, for just one moment, we can nonetheless be sure that it was work worth doing, as so many of the games of this era have soundtracks still rightly regarded by composers and game fans alike as among the very best ever on offer from digital gaming, even 30 years later. Previous games in the series took strides towards the modern established form of game structure, starting with the inclusion of worlds filled with a number of levels, and progressing from that to having themed worlds. We all know what we're talking about here. Sand world, ice world, sky world. If you played any games in or of the 8-bit era, you know exactly what we're talking about here. But Hyper Glycol Cube shook up the notion of worlds even further, helping to mature the format. The game presented you worlds filled with levels, just like earlier games in and out of the series. But this game didn't present them to you as ice world, sand world generalities. Instead, they were presented as legitimate regions of a larger world. It wasn't a desert, because the game needed a desert world. That's just where the desert in this world was. It was a game design revelation that infused story and fictive weight into the gameplay in a way that had previously only been attempted, with varying degrees of success, but obviously nothing that tied the concept together in as neat a bow as Hyper Glycol Cube had ever been seen in any country by any set of gamers at the time. It was as revolutionary as it was revelatory. The scene of the action had changed without much explanation. Somehow the Hyperion Glaxol force had blown off course and found themselves stranded on Arcatron Archipelago, where agents of old nemesis Gremcore Prime Ultimar had ensnared the friendly local Chorakizords. It was down to Galactigon Alpha Edra to save the hapless Chorakizordi people and put a stop to grim old Gremcore Prime, reclaim the Ultimarillion of Arcatron, and reunite the feuding Choraitia and Kizordi clans. The story took our hero across 9 unique ecospheres, each of which contained a dungeon fortress occupied by a different commandant of the Grem Grumlin Grudel Corps. When Galactigan liberated each subsequent fortress dungeon, he unsealed that world's so-called prophecy prism, contributing a separate strand of colored starlight to final, purely optional Rain Grid Bowbridge Chromachasm set of challenges. Without the full spectrum of colors to make up the bridge, the very final bonus battle remains inaccessible to the player.
My childhood memories of exploring the vast expanse presented in Hyper Glycol Cube are bound up with other memories of the era, when new episodes of the animated The Real Ghostbusters were in production. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were yet to experience even one reboot. And Back to the Future was still a story about someone from the present day going into the distant past. Not a tale about a kid from the distant past going into the slightly more distant past. The first run of Child and Grissom's Bloodsucker and Sweet Tooth was just being published, and I remember sneaking copies from my older sister's bedroom and reading them late at night when she was out on dates, reveling in the insane. Vivid illustrations of the candy-craving undead detectives and their genuinely baffling mysteries. Knowing that this forbidden literature held all the secrets to teenagerdom, and still not being able to understand them when I saw them. By day, I ventured further into the archatronic wilderness. By night, I combed the streets of Pueblo, New Colorado, with Blood Sugar and Sweet Tooth, the melodies of Hyper Glycol Cube still ringing in my ears.
It's impossible to describe what it was actually like to be a child in this era. The adults around us were constantly baffled and befuddled by the increasing profusion of digitization in all aspects of life, certain that these newfangled 20 megahertz processors and 4 megabyte RAM chips were a bunch of hogwash, but for all the proliferation of processing power, it was impossible to look up anything on the internet. What online sources for video game tips and news there were consisted of text forums that attracted only a certain type of person, who was by self-selection abnormal enough to expend resources on an expensive and difficult means of connecting to a Usenet forum, when the overwhelming majority of people neither knew nor cared that such a thing was possible. A bike ride through the woods on an autumn night when the wind was soft and the light was coming through the leaves at a mystic angle and you started thinking the magic you sensed around you in the corners was something real, something with weight. But you knew if you turned your head to look, the nameless thing you felt would skitter away from the corners of your vision and back into the trees. Is that still what it is like? There's geolocation and playlists and all of the things that are so obvious now and weren't yet even rabid fantasies. Then, do they change the fundamental reality of riding a bike through the trees at 7 years old? Or is that still mostly the same? Asking for a friend. I'll never forget my first full bike ride at sunset, and I'll never forget my first, second, third, or 53rd trip through the Arcatron archipelago. They aren't fully two memories for me, two distinct and separate things. The sunlight on the leaves of my childhood bike path and streaming through the gnarled branches of the arboretum of the Eidolon mingle in my mind into one radiant, fragmented ombromany in my heart. And that is the sunlight, and those are the leaves that all the waking moments of my current life must compete with for my affection and favor. Is it any wonder that the world seems so cold now, when the leaves and sun must earn their place against such ruthlessly enduring, relentlessly primal sensations? The first time Gremcore Prime swoops down in his infernal Annihiladrex heptagon and attempts to ensnare Galactagon in his deconstrual mesh. The first tremulous steps into the haunted halls of the endless labyrinth of Lacrimosa. The first gentle lappings of the waves at the shore of Chetal Muldoon. The long-abandoned grave of the gravel tears. One lone maiden still waiting with flowers for the Chorikizord prince who would never return. These are as real and true to me as my first skinned knee, the first space shuttle takeoff I ever saw life, the stinging bite of salt in a paper cut at the age of 3, flaring endlessly in the fingers of memory that grip my brain and spread their tendrils through what I perceive as the fullness of my life. These are among the fundamental elements of what it means to be me. And it just so happens, these experiences are fundamental to what it probably means to be you and most of your friends. The world of Hyper Glycol Cube is a fundamental experience even to children today. It's part of what it means to be human in this time of the world, and one of the most remarkable things about the entire first-party Velga Ultra VGA lineup is this. It doesn't seem that the people responsible for these memories had the slightest idea how culturally significant what they were producing was. The longevity of this work, the fusion of different artistic disciplines into one living, breathing whole. The fact that this wasn't just a nice thing kids would remember, but something that shaped them in heretofore unsuspected ways. It is absolutely not clear that the people involved understood the magnitude of their cultural contribution at the time. Do such people known at the time? Or is it something they only grasp later, after listening to the world tell them how important their work is? Does listening to the world tell you you're important to help create? It is unclear. It doesn't seem to be helpful at any rate. That's what happened to Child and Grissom after that first, never eclipsed run of Blood Sugar and Sweet Tooth. They paid more attention to the braying voices of the public than the quiet, small voices of their artistry. And when they split up, Bill Child to illustrate the Arachnosaur series and Rich Grissom to write Season 4 of Crab Nebula, the ending of their artistic partnership marked a clear demarcation point in the careers of both men. Thankfully, no similar fate befell the creative team of Hyper Glycol Cube. No, their story is all the more perplexing. The people who made Hyper Glycol Cube the #1 touch point in the youths of multiple generations didn't stop working together. They just resolutely decided they did not need to follow up Hyper Glycol Cube with a game remotely similar to it. Ever. Still, to this day, over 30 years later, that is a mystery I am not equipped to explain, but it has ensured that Hyper Glycol Cube remains one of the most unique landmarks in the history of interactive computing, however frustrating that uniqueness might be for people desperate to experience the archipelago again for the first time. Velga was the only video game company at the time to have perceived the value of the print publishing market to their ongoing operations, instead of spending money on advertising in competitors' magazines, which they also did. Of course, Velga realized that they could create their own magazine, and children were so enthusiastic about the world of video games that they would not perceive it as marketing, but instead as a gift to fans. This was an innovative strategy at the time, but it is worth remarking that it only worked because people literally were excited about the topic. I strongly suspect that companies couldn't have put out a catalogue for steaming broccoli and eating nothing but smoothies made thereof, and it would not have had as salutary an effect upon sales of steamed broccoli smoothie components. Of course, Velga Ultra VGA magazine, as it was retitled, and the wake of the launch of the Ultra VGA, wasn't just marketing by any standards. Indeed, in those pre-internet times, the pages of strategies and maps to the levels of the games were often the only difference between an impassable brick wall in the gameplay or quickly continuing on with your adventure. And it was very revealing in an odd way, because as a child consumer of this video game content, you quickly came to think of the games from the developer's viewpoint. it was only a small leap from seeing the game worlds mapped out as screens of content in the magazine to thinking of the game themselves as collections of content laid out on a ROM chip. Velga Entertronics have been pushing their latest product hard in the magazine for about a year. As a first grader in the time before the internet, I had literally no means of knowing this fact. But Velga had been concealing a startling truth. Most of their major product launches occurred over a year in their country of origin before being localized and brought to the Western world. This meant that little kids on the other side of the planet had become long since familiar with the world of the Arcatron archipelago, while to me it was nothing but the future promise of an as-yet hazy adventure. By the time I learned of this, it no longer seemed a grave injustice that would have driven me mad. So it is a mercy. I was completely blissfully unaware as a child. I'm confident that the arbitrariness of this disparity would have struck me as grossly, savagely unfair. And as silly and childish as that concern seems to me now, I can't claim to not understand why a first-grade child would feel left out, knowing that half a world away, little children were already bored of an experience that you had been craving for a year. What is more understandable than that? The marketing had ratcheted up to a fever pitch by the September launch of the Ultra VGA, making the interminable wait between late September and December 25th seem infinite to my young mind. There was no amount of time separating me and my first journeys into the depths and heights of the archipelago that would have been endurable, tolerable, or permissible to my mind at that time. I wouldn't know a painful, slow erosion of the hours like this again in life until recovering from opiate addiction. In retrospect, it took me years to recover from the susceptibility to the promise of marketing material from this phase in my life. Because for a short time, what was delivered on that marketing material was Hyper Glycol Cube, was Jurassic Park, was these legendary things that are justly regarded years later as classics in their field. It made it very difficult to not believe similar advertisements for seemingly similar products that promise similar results. And I think the goodwill of wanting to see that quality in something and accepting that it likely does have that level of quality sight unseen, because you want to believe that there could be another thing that good available to you very soon. That goodwill is a fine and beautiful thing to nurture inside your heart. But too often the goodwill is misused by people who aren't concerned about providing you life-altering experiences that you will take with you forever, but who just want to keep doing the job they're doing and getting paid for it. An understandable motivation for these people, to be sure. but it is possible to earn a living in ways that don't trade upon the tarnishing of the human capacity for hope. I would suggest that these people consider such fields.
Of Hyper Glycol Cube stand out above all others in my memory. The friendly Toric swords that the player could tame and ride, and the skin-crawling vibe of the horrific, cursed ruins. A type of level filled with ghastly apparitions of the deceased rulers of long since vanished kingdoms that still haunted their dilapidated palaces, striking at Galactagon with reanimated fury if the player set foot in their echoing chambers in search of prisms. Both of these examples reveal something very important about Hyper Glycol Cube in its role as not just a standalone game, but as the launch title for the Ultra VGA. Both of these examples, the rideable Horkazords and the Cursed Ruins, filled with transparent layers, dozens of sprites, incredible numbers of phantasms simultaneously, were realized through a combination of impressive gameplay ideas and the expanding capabilities of the 16-bit hardware. Neither of these were possible on the 8-bit Velga Entertronic system. But it wasn't just that these aspects of the game were now possible that made them so appealing. Indeed, a large number of things are now possible that weren't in 1991. But that's not why people found the Chorikid swords so charming and indispensable. That's not what sent a chill up your spine when you entered the creaky gates of your first cursed ruin, marveling at the hordes of the undead streaming past through the solid ceiling above. It was only part of it anyway.
This was a time when the new technological improvements still felt centered on ART and expression, and it shows in a million tiny touches that suggest more with their simplicity than all the fully rendered forests of the present day could ever hope to do. However more accurate the ray-traced sunlight through the 4K leaves might be in some technical sense, they'll never be as catalytic to the player's imagination as a game that asks you to make the art come alive in your heart. That's an aspect of this form of creativity that is lost with the innocence of the medium through the passing of years. The art of collaborating with the player in imaginative rendering, replaced by ever more technically sophisticated simulacrums that cause little mental response in the player, because in this new modality, the player is merely a deficient decision-making computational device instead of a collaborator in an imaginative enterprise. When it comes to expanding upon the images on screen, there is no life that needs to be instilled by the player. And so the player merely absorbs and reacts. Still, I am told, a fun activity, but not one that continues to hold my interest. Personally, perhaps I could be coaxed back to the fold by a hint that the edges of the screen contain untold wonders forever beyond my reach, but only just. Perhaps then I could make some time.
By the time you were about halfway through the game, you could feel something magical happening in your hands and eyes. You began to not just grasp interfacing with this strange new world through the controller, but you began to truly feel at one. This is the moment when the mental training wheels come off. You start realizing you're leaning to the left or right and sticking bits of your tongue between tightly mashed teeth. With every death-defying leap, you make across purportedly bottomless chasms. How, pray tell, would Galactagon get out of a pit with no end? By the midway point of the game, you could feel the most indescribable confidence moving through the trees, the oceans, the spirit-ravaged depths of the cursed ruins. No 7-year-old feels such confidence in their daily life as they did climbing a skyward spiral staircase erupting out of a somehow levitating treasure block. My grandmother never understood, and my own children never know a world without. And here I am in the middle, losing at both ends, and certain that what I'm still holding on to, what hasn't seeped through the gaps in my fingers, is worth trying to grasp for a second longer. Do I know? Does anyone? Not really. Not really. By the middle of the game, even the least adventurous players had surely stumbled upon a secret pathway or two. Once you see the world map twist and change in response to unlocking the secret exits, even the most by-the-book player couldn't help but grow enamored. It is around this point that the sheer weight of this hidden content begins to astound the more observant player. Just how many secrets could be concealed around any and all corners? It seemed like there was no end to the tiny touches, the little mysteries, what are now called Easter eggs. So do spare a moment to reflect on the thought that the ROM chip containing this entire adventure is half of 1 megabyte in size. The video of this playthrough was 35 gigabytes, an amount of information 70,000 times greater. This sort of geometric progression of technical devices is indicative of the last 50 years of technological development, but it is odd how intrinsically things like bit depth are related to the experience in these early console generations. People who played 8-bit, a few questions. Do you remember any items allowing you to collect 127 or 255 of something, but no more? People who used MIDI equipment in the 1980s or beyond, any idea why every parameter allows you to set a value between 0 and 127? The bit depth literally does not allow for values greater than 128 or 256, or if 0 is the start point, 127 or 255. Fascinating. 16 was the maximum simultaneous on-screen colors out of a total possible 256 for the Velga Entertronic system. On the 16-bit Ultra VGA, 256 simultaneous colors were possible out of a total of 16.8 million color combinations. A set of values we still see listed today on RGB lighting, for example. Our current 4K Dolby Vision TVs have a color gamut of just over 1 billion colors. Each of these values is determined at some point along the chain by the bit depth that the colors can be stored in. Perhaps in 100 years, measuring any of this stuff in our current systems will seem quaint. How many different gradations of reality can there be to reflect digitally? What level of bit depth could encode the entire universe, everything in it, and everything that possibly could be in it? How far away are we from knowing, or how infinitely close to never knowing might we as a species be? Some may claim to know the answer, but I myself do not. In the previous installment in the series, Glycol Cube Cubed, but the two manners of implementation between the two games could not have been more different. Well, they quite easily could have been more different, but they were sufficiently different, allow us to say, to be worthy of comment, that, I believe, can be safely assumed by all. But of course, they could always have been more different. One could have made Galactagon turn into a pig, while the other kept him the same, but drained all of his energy tokens. That would have been an even more stark and vivid contrast than that which I was originally trying to make between the two gameplay implementations of the flying mechanic. But I would hope I needn't undertake such ardent logic chopping again with you in the course of our present frank discussion. I hope the time is very far removed when anyone could accuse me of chopping with a logician. At any rate, now that I have hedged my lexical bets by equivocating heavily on a matter of the utmost unimportance, I want to bring your attention round once more to the matter at hand. It's this blasted subject of flight. Flight, as the understood by the dictionary, is the power of a being to move through the air at will. I bring up this dictionary definition not to insult the viewer's intelligence, but instead of to point to all the ways in which it fails to describe flight in the third Glycol game, which fans have taken to calling GC3 Online, because how else will confusion proliferate through all of existence at a fast enough rate to ensure total dissatisfaction with human life by sundown. In the final entry in the 8-bit iteration of the Glycol game universe, the player could fly, but not at will. The player had to fill up the melodious geograph, the most eye-rolling attempt at a pun from Velga to this day, to my knowledge, by firing their thrusters at max speed. It was impossible to take off without a clear runway to complete the avionic metaphor. Oh, how different were the flight mechanisms in Hyper Glycol Cube. Again, admittedly, they were not as different as an infinite possible set of combinations of unlikely attributes. But here, in this most real of all possible worlds, they were different enough for jazz and hand grenades. The 16-bit iteration was, for almost all newcomers, shockingly accurate in its depiction of the method for stabilizing aerial movement. But these accurate physical analogies between the controls and actual wind tunnel physics has denied and astounded young players. Counterintuitive movements, counterintuitive to little kids, at first anyway, were required to remain aloft. One had to lean backwards, as it were, to gain height and nosedive for speed, only to sweep back up like a bat again. When the whole routine became old hat, it was quite the thrill to literally bypass whole levels on a lark with a few well-timed counterbalances. But between the first time you gained the jet blast belt in the second level and the time you were soaring over challenges, an exorbitant amount of pungent frustration had been expended in the gaining of this hard-won skill. In the 8-bit game, you merely meshed your thumb like a man possessed to keep aloft until your geograph inevitably petered out and you plummeted like a stone. That's all there was to it, that and was running leaps from. Somehow, that made sense to a little boy. To fly, you ran as fast as you could, then mashed some unknown action as fast as you could, until you were soaring, soaring, soaring above the clouds, which your best friend assured you tasted exactly like whatever your favorite flavor of cotton candy was. Somehow, that felt natural. The balance-dependent poise required of the reflection of actual flight, represented on the 16-bit machine, didn't seem to make any sense at all at first. But in the end, it relied on no magic, just strict adherence to known principles. It was a skill, but a skill that could be learned even by a gangly child. Provided that sage child had access, of course, to the occasional jet blast belt hidden in floating treasure boxes.
The whole idea of the cursed ruins seemed terrifying to me at first as a child, though I was, of course, thrilled to explore them digitally at a safe remove again and again. But quickly they began to attract my attention in another way. They had the most secret exits, and thus the most paths to the ultimate in hidden prizes, the prophecy prisms. Only by completing the entwined strands of colored starlight could Galactagon bring ultimate and lasting peace to the Arcatron archipelago, and thus these confounding Escherian ruins with their spectral vanishing doors that led back upon themselves in mind-bending ways that violated all known laws of space and time became increasingly essential in the quest to achieve 100% in the game. The goal of any child with sense in 1991. I assure you of that much. But it was scary having to explore these ancient, accursed tombs of long-vanquished kings, knowing they would punish you savagely for violating the sanctity of their burial places. It was daunting, knowing that the levels would not play fair in terms of being absolutely incomprehensibly non-linear. You knew full well, going in, that it was not going to make coherent sense, and yet you needed somehow to come to understand it if you had any hope of uncovering its devilishly hidden secrets, and quite possibly the path to next shard of prophecy prism. The stakes seemed, for some inexplicable reason, unutterably high. More than the need to defeat Gremcore and rescue the love of your life. Gemstar Prisma Stone from the clutches of the Grem Gromlin, Gruddle Commandants. More than the need to bring peace to the squabbling Chor-Itia and Kizordi clans. It was this strangely adult-seeming need to do the very ungrown-up act of completing the bridge across the chroma chasm and unlock the final challenge that drove me as a child. It was a game design that was brought to its ultimate form in the late in the console's life cycle Ultra VGA title Canyon Tracer Rangers 2 Paroxysm Paradigm, at least in my opinion. But in the dawn of the Ultra VGA, this level of what is now called after-game content was unprecedented. It went not just beyond what the player expected, but well beyond what the player considered, beyond their expectations at that time. It created an entire new universe of new expectations of future titles, but at the time it merely seemed unimaginably vast, vastly imaginative, and more like a window into a strangely sketched but ultimately vibrant other wilderness filled with mythically large actors like Gremcore Prime and the almost wholly unknowable Galactagon himself, who became more a collection of recognizable traits and less of a character the longer the series has gone on.
As I grew older, and this game went from a launch title to a treasured classic to a sort of weak portal from adulthood to a semblance of the childhood glow of a Christmas tree before dawn on a winter's morning, a memory briefly reanimated that this game was among the few pleasures I returned to on an annual or near annual basis for the remainder of my childhood and young adulthood. As I grew older still, those annual playthroughs came at longer and longer intervals until I merely came to remember even those. All turns to memories until we are gone, and then they turn to even less. So no matter how grim, treasure the memories you have, however badly they burn your mind to hold on to. But it still feels like a few seconds of looking at screens from this game is enough to put me right back on the path to Gremcore Prime to watch out for grumbling grem buddies falling from an endless chute above, knowing that you can ignore the third treasure block. It's just a dumb old gem medallion, but the one immediately above it contains one of those precious jet blast belts. It kind of frightens me how quickly it all comes back. What if other, less savory memories come back in similar fashion? I am not prepared for that. Is that why I cling to the archipelagan paths of the Arcatron trails, the Grumogreps, and the Bladen Grylo cryonosphere? Because there are things back there in the shadowy corners of what's left of 1991 in my brain that badly needs me to remember the joy of exploring underground as Galactagon, so I don't take notice of their shambling forms writhing in the seams and margins of my own traitorous memories. I don't think I like that thought at all. But if that is, in fact, the truth, then I am certainly very, very, very profoundly very grateful for the existence of Hyper Glycol Cube to absorb that anguish for me. For Velga so loved the world, they gave their endlessly begotten Galactagon, and it was good.
In millions of people's minds for almost a generation. Which is why it was so disconcerting when, upon their eventual reappearance in Glycol Cube Regraphed for the Velga Tripletron handheld in 2005, everything we knew about the Grim Commanders was hand-waved away by a new official backstory. They weren't Gruddle leaders, but actually a team of 7 robots created by Gremcore Prime to enforce his will on the distant battalions of his massive army of gremlins, Grepos, Grubats, Projectilepedis, Clumbos, Dordavus, Eardavoms, Leplefangs, Floplafongs, Fungibangs, Lingaboos, Rigabumps, Vesselbeezles, Weaselwombos, Jaw-snapping Snubfuzzles, Whiz-banging Flonglabungs,
puzzly, busy bee bumbler buggies, and the ever-vigilant glumbo creepers, particularly their hyperfusion form, the grim gremlaw grimgrub griever reaver, grief gardener himself, the green bug glom grappler gut guzzler, fuzz wombler buzz bombler, womble womble wimble bumble gripo, grub grub, cleaver tartar barium, coria borium emporia, empire ia, emporo I, futs puzzle wingus, victus voctus flectus, toserian tosarian, tosarium posturio lestamesta, recobrec, flicnactus, noctavius canloctavius, glyn block block, magmatic grammatic mini-boss, a one-time only encounter in the penultimate fortress that astounded and amazed players with what still remains the longest ever single-sentence text box in a game of the 16-bit era. Even competing 16-bit consoles which featured CD-ROM attachments didn't top it.
But to return to the Gruddle commanders, we had always been told that they were originally low-ranking members of the Gremlin Corps that had been promoted for valor in battle. Now, decades later, they were merely robots. Velga attempted to spin this revision as reflecting the Gremlin troops, learning the truth about their commanders in the more recent games. And the old games were merely the backstory Gremcorp Prime had cooked up to sell the troops on obeying a robot. It still seemed needlessly disruptive to the established narrative to far too many adult men. As with so many other changing aspects of life, these adults asked if they can change the Grum Commandants into robots, if they can say Pluto isn't a planet anymore, if they can make a Teen Titans cartoon that's hilarious instead of serious. What else can they change? What else indeed?
Forget the first time I got to the final world in Hyper Glycol Cube. Through sheer chance, the conclusion to the first run of Blood Sugar and Sweet Tooth was unfolding week by week, just as I made my way to the Gremcorp Keep in the heart of the archipelago. Something about the darkness invading a formerly sweet, candy-filled vision linked the two experiences permanently in my mind. Blood Sugar and Sweet Tooth had been tracing down the clues to a terrifying supernatural series of brutal murders. Between cracking jokes and candy canes to satiate their endless undead hunger for candy. I know this sounds too perfect to be true, but when I snuck into my older sister's room the night after, first encountering, but not defeating, the ultimate boss fight with Gremcorp Prime reeling from that incredible reveal. Blood sugar and sweet tooth were double vampires, candy and traditional, and had actually been tracking down clues to murders they had committed the entire series. I knew I wouldn't get to sleep for some time, and the ambiguous resolution to a mystery that had kept me up nights all winter long. So, the good guys were the bad guys. A great twist, beyond my first great capacity for ethical reasoning, made me yearn for some moral clarity. Galacticon was good. Grimcore was bad. Grimcore wanted to hurt people. Galacticon wanted to help people. I could help Galacticon by being Galacticon. I could stop Grimcore by throwing multiples of his own explosive devices into his whirling event horizon, where they would be pulled into his neutron atomizer and disrupt his deflection drive, crashing his time wheel and freeing the Charizard people, and releasing Gemstar from the Ruby prison. I still remember it taking me 27 tries the first time. I am not sure if I kept accurate count, but that is the number that lingers in my mind. It was only the second time in my life I stayed up past midnight ever. Upon repeat playthroughs, the final boss fight isn't even that hard. Or maybe it just isn't that difficult if you've gone on to play the rest of the 16-bit generation library, and that isn't your first brush with it. But I think it worked to Gremcore's advantage that I was so rattled by the reveal that the good guy detectives had been tracking down their own gruesome evidence of a string of grisly mass murders that they legitimately didn't know they had been committing. It got under my skin. I understood for the first time one of the differences between kids' stories and maybe when you're older stories, and it made my skin crawl. What they were trying to protect us from, I came to realize in my limited 7-year-old way, was that this vision of the world, a rosy, happy, everybody gets along place and is happy. And if somebody is doing something wrong, it's because they're a huge, giant cybernetic lizard monster who is stopped via a charming adventure. And then it's back to the candy bushes with smiling faces. It was obviously not the world that not kids lived in. I could handle living in the shades of gray world of reality. It was being told I lived in Candyland, believing it until I was 8, and realizing it was as fake as Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, and then performing the spiritual equivalent of walking in on my parents' rapping Santa's Presents. Reading a story that against children the world has ever otherwise nurtured. It's never been a lifetime of reading, but it also started living. Defeated Grimcore. No matter how tired or bleary-eyed or sore-thumbed I became, because I needed, before I could possibly sleep that night, to see a good guy stop a bad guy, needed Galacticons alone. I just always wonder if it would be easier to just let kids know from the beginning that the good guys are usually the bad guys too, and they too usually don't even know it until it's too late. But then I see my own kids grinning at their heroes, and I don't have the heart to tell them that adults aren't grown up enough to give them that world, even though it's something we know full well we can do. We just aren't there yet, as a species, to bother following through on the kind of world we love to show our children. And that's a great heartache to me.
Rain-grid Bowbridge chromachasm by obtaining every single shard of the prophecy prisms took a bit longer, but thanks to my impeccably thorough Velga Ultra VGA Player's Guide, gigantic book of the game that came with a 12-month renewal of the magazine, I was able to sort it out in the end without save states. If I had save states as a child, I could have beaten any game immediately, a fact I mention continuously to my young son when I lose repeatedly in new video games. I think he knows the truth, but I still have to try. But even the most cleverly concealed and assiduously guarded prophecy prisms, hidden in the murkiest depths of the most horrific cursed ruins, eventually fell into my hands. Upon completing the final challenge, what seemed like one last miracle packed into that 0.5 megabyte took place. A massive sprite and palette swap intended to show the Arcatron archipelago after the Chor-Itia and Kisordi reunification as vassals of the freshly restored Gemstar and the reclamation of the Ultimarillion of Arcatron. But my tiny victorious self didn't know what a sprite swap was. I just saw a world transformed by peace, by healing, by reunification, and by a bunch of very colourful lizard buddies. challenges of the Raingrid Bowbridge chromachasm were, strategy guide or no, incredibly difficult. For me at least. They were pointedly designed by the game's developers to be extreme challenges for the very best players. But to children, they were more like rock walls to bash yourself against again and again, until that unbelievable moment where somehow the repeat batterings by your tiny frame were enough to shatter the wall to dust and allow you to pass through. It taught me perseverance in the service of some difficult but worthwhile goal, at the very least. Perhaps mastering the chromachasm wasn't as worthwhile as learning a new language or an instrument or something, but it was great training to eventually do those things for me, perhaps for others. I suspect so. But the build-up to the final fight with Gremkor's ultimate form was nightmarishly dynamic. The tension rose with every hard-won forward advance across stages suspended in limbo, dangling from bizarre funiculars, depending from nothing whatsoever, leaping across hoary, root-encrusted chasms in the secret back chambers of the Arboretum of Eidolon. Long before you actually got to the transmogrified eldritch abomination of the Gremkor Prime. Altimar in his shape-shifting essence as pure energy and malice. You feared what you would find when you reached that high ruin and demanded parley with the Lord of Darkness himself. The scene had been set by the hellscape of not quite insurmountable challenges that the brutal armies of Grupo Greps and Grumbo Grubs and faced off with the ferocious Victus, Woctus, Flictus, Tossarian, Bossarian, Rosteriolistanista. He of so many trivia lists for longest set of text boxes, saying one sentence whose full name we need not utter here. I took pains to sound out every last syllable as a child, and I have no clue how it escaped me, just how Lovecraftian and demented the thing sounded. I just thought it was funny how long and silly it was. But Recobrecto Flignoctus, Noctavius, Gunloctavius? My God, it's a wonder that all the children of America, Christmas morning 1992, didn't inadvertently open a portal to the 15th nether dimension. But getting that first glimpse of the horrifying disco-infused death metal hell awaiting at pinnacle of the Arcatron heights, after already overcoming so much to get even the glimpse, it was enough to give me second thoughts, as much much as the comics of Child and Grissom had forced me to confront morality. Because that horrific lightning-scarred edifice represented something else, something that scared little kids and old men alike: mortality. What was the morality of living? What are the limits of mortality? How are these things connected? It was impossible, even for a first grader, to have worked their way through the infernal traps of the Rainbridge Bowbridge chromachasm and confront the keep of the dread Gremcore Prime himself without facing all of these existential, endless questions.
I remember unlocking the final bonus chamber before the final battle. The by now familiar striped pattern and the ordered geometry of it, clinging to the sanity, clinging to the order. Knowing that however many treasure boxes I burst open, no matter how many jet blast belts I had in my inventory, one, since that was the maximum, if you must know, that the final battle would be a thing of pure fury, of no order, of no sanity. Gremcore Prime was the worst of the worst. He would heed no rule of battle, no time-honored tradition of chivalry. He had imprisoned Gemstar herself in the ghastliest cage in the depths of his psychotic Randall Flagg vision of power. He was not going to take my feelings into consideration. He cared not one whit what happened to Galactagon, and he surely did not care about how any little girl or boy playing Galactagon felt. He would, if he were aware of me, eradicate me fully, utterly. With a grin on his cybernetic face, his demon fangs flashing in the sick light of his horrific neon obscenity of a tower, and the intermittent but ceaseless illumination clawing through the scene with every 16-bit flash of lightning.
Can any words convey the terror my 7-year-old heart felt as that final gate creaked violently and slowly opened? The horrific visages of every slain Mad King from every cursed ruin staring down at me with insane grinning rictuses, outlining their hideous hate for the universe of light and form. I could feel their insane malice enveloping me as I passed under, knowing that inside I would face a foe greater still than even they. Darkness. Flickering flames of eldritch terrors. Insane, grinning, lashing hatred at the blistering top of the world. Engulfed in madness and surrounded by loathsome, twisted forms of the hideous disdain of the beautiful maid manifest as a cybernetic demon lizard. A cataclysmic, catastrophic, entropic battle to the death rages in my heart, in my body to this day. Even now, I am on that checkerboard tower roof, battling to the death with that hateful lizard, and I know, at the back and the front of my mind, that once he sets me ablaze crazy and throws me from his lightning spear tower to dash myself to pieces on the jagged rocks below, it will be over. There is no reset button, no continue option. When the mad grinning Demon King burns you and hurtles you off the Tower of Life, everyone is playing for keeps. I learned to fear my own fragility on that peak, and I will only unlearn to fear it from within my own death.
To be able to give.